Welcome to Easy Rubrics. By the end of this video, you will be able to identify 4 different types of rubric and have an easy time applying them to the assessments in your own courses. A rubric is an assessment tool that explicitly lists the criteria for student work and articulates the levels of quality for each criterion. Why do we use rubrics? Well, rubrics allow learners to understand exactly what is expected of them on any given assessment. Rubrics make the grading process objective and fair. And finally, rubrics provide learners with the feedback they need to improve. There are 4 main types of rubric, all with their inherent strengths and weaknesses. The first rubric is the holistic rubric. The second rubric we'll be looking at is the analytic rubric. The third rubric is the single point rubric. And the final one we'll be looking at today is the good old-fashioned checklist. Here is an example of a holistic rubric. And if you can judge by the name, you'll know that a holistic rubric marks an assessment as a whole. As you can see in the right-hand column here, the criteria is listed for satisfying the level on the left-hand column. The holistic rubric has some pros, which are that it scores the overall process, which might be handy for certain assessments. The holistic rubric is efficient and easy to create. And finally, the holistic rubric focuses on the positive, which might help boost student confidence in the early days of the course. The cons associated with the holistic rubric are that there is no targeted feedback, which might leave learners confused. The holistic rubric is also known as being somewhat subjective, meaning that if you gave a number of instructors the same rubric to mark one student's assignment, they might all arrive at different levels. And finally, because there is no targeted feedback and the rubric might be somewhat confusing to learners, you might be spending a lot of your time explaining to students where they went wrong. The second rubric here is the analytic rubric. As you can see, the assessment tasks are broken down into graded levels. You can change the weighting of your level depending on its importance to the assessment. The analytic rubric has its pros and cons as well. Some of the pros include that it provides clear expectations for students. You can use this as an instructional tool so that students know exactly what to do for their assessment. The analytic rubric provides targeted feedback, and you can change your marks and weigh them based on the importance, as I've already mentioned. Finally, for a pro for the analytic rubric is that the analytic rubric is completely objective. There are cons, though. The analytic rubric takes a lot of time to create. And for some assignments, it might not be worth spending this amount of time to create the rubric. When you're creating an analytic rubric, you must ensure that the criteria is well defined so that it is easier to assess. And finally, the analytic rubric is sometimes more successfully used alongside exemplars from previous years and previous learner work. The single point rubric has gained a lot of popularity in recent years. The single point rubric is a hybrid between the analytic and the holistic rubrics. As you can see here, the criteria is listed in the middle column, and there are blank spaces to write manual feedback in the right and left columns. The single point rubric has its pros and cons as well. The single point rubric is incredibly easy to create and use. The single point rubric focuses on both the strengths and weaknesses of any assessment. This rubric is also really great for assessing assignments that are more creative in nature. And the single point rubric is an excellent peer assessment tool. Some of the cons of this rubric is that you must take the time to actually write out individualized feedback in each of the columns. This rubric does not formulate an exact grade when you're finished. It's more organic in nature. And finally, this type of rubric is difficult to construct in Brightspace or other learning management systems, which might kind of turn you off from this rubric. And finally, we have the good old-fashioned checklist. As you can see here, the skills checklist details steps of a procedure, and the success is determined on whether or not the steps have been completed. The checklist, of course, has its pros and cons as well. This is an incredibly easy rubric to create and use. If you know the steps of a procedure, you just simply list them, and then you have the pass-fail columns to the right. This is actually great for procedural assessments and self-reflection. So while this rubric might not count for a final grade, you can actually use it for student self-reflection. And finally, this rubric gives incredibly clear expectations for learners. They know exactly what they're going to have to do to get a good grade or pass an assessment. The cons of this rubric is that it's not suitable for all types of assessments or subjects, and you can tell that just by looking at it. Some people have commented that this rubric is too basic and there's no room for feedback. And that might be because it's extremely rigid and prescriptive in nature. So now that we've learned about the 4 different types of rubrics, let's break down their strengths and weaknesses even further. If you're looking for a generic rubric that is appropriate for many different types of assessment, you'll want to go with the holistic rubric or the single point rubric. If you're looking for more of a task-specific rubric, you're going to want to opt for the analytic rubric or the checklist rubric. If you want your rubric to be learner-centered and actually consult your learners in the creation of your rubric, you might want to opt for the analytic rubric or the single point rubric. And if you'd like something to be a little bit more teacher-centered, where you can create it on your own, you can opt for the holistic or the checklist rubrics. Now it's time for us to make our own rubric. I've recently moved into a new home, and I thought it would be kind of fun to design a rubric for painting a room. There are 3 main steps that we should take to create any form of rubric. The first step is to define the learning outcomes of the unit, module, lesson, etc., whatever assessment you're creating. Then you're going to describe the assessment tasks that cover these outcomes. And finally, you're going to want to identify the standards of performance for these assessment tasks. I think for this paint job, we're going to opt for the analytic rubric. So let's think about the outcome for our paint job. What do we want to see at the end? Well, personally, I want to see a perfect, professional looking paint job. That's what I want as an outcome to this assessment. Secondly, you're going to want to define the assessment tasks, and I have decided that the main assessment tasks for a perfect paint job include the wall blemishes being patched up and covered, even paint distribution or coverage. And because I like things neat and tidy, I'd like an after project cleanup. And then we're going to have a walk through the performance standards that I've decided upon for this paint job. So as you can see here, I have broken up my paint job outcomes into 4 levels: beginning, developing, accomplished, and exemplary. And I have assigned a mark to each one of these levels, which really makes this an analytic rubric. So I have decided that my performance standards for exemplary will be that wall blemishes are filled and patched with appropriate materials, and that patched blemishes are sanded down evenly and smoothly. And then for a beginning level or an insufficient level, we would say the project is incomplete because the wall blemishes were not even addressed before painting. And as you can see here, I have filled in the accomplished and developing levels using different adverbs and adjectives to clarify what I expect. For my second performance standard here, we have even paint coverage. And I have the same marking system, so it's all weighted the same as our first performance standard. And the exemplary level here, 4 marks, would be that all walls, including corners, ceiling, and trim, were primed and painted with 2 coats of paint. And there is no evidence of former paint color showing through. For a beginning level here, the walls were primed once but not painted, so obviously that will not get full marks. And there is significant evidence of former paint color showing through. And again, my accomplished and developing levels fit between the exemplary and the beginning levels. It's up to you as to how many levels you're going to have or how many marks you're going to assign to each level here. That is your prerogative. And finally, my performance standard for after project cleanup for the exemplary level would be that furniture, floors, and windows are completely free from splatter and paint residue, and all painting materials are cleaned meticulously and put away. And for the beginning level, no steps were taken to protect furniture, floors, and windows, and used painting materials were left scattered around the project area. Gasp. So we've completed our rubric, and this rubric would have been worth 12 points because we had 3 performance standards with a total of 4 marks per performance standard. When in doubt, don't forget that the CLRs and EKSs in your course outlines are actually predefined standards that you can use for your own rubrics. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when you're creating a rubric. You should actually be following your course outline quite closely when you are creating any assessments. For more information, you can contact me, Sheila O'Brien, at o'briens@algonquincollege.com with any questions you might have about how to design rubrics for your own assessments. And if you have any questions about how to create rubrics in Brightspace, please reach out to our educational technologist, Julia Chapesky, at chapesj@algonquincollege.com. We look forward to hearing from you and assisting you with anything that you might need. And of course, here are my references. Thank you for watching.